Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I thought I'd do something a little different, and rather than provide instruction on how to make something or directions for a specific technique, I would just talk you through my thought process as I work on a commission project for a client. And hopefully this would help to create some prompts for you to consider when you're working on projects of your own. So let's get into it. Whenever I work on panels like you'd see in Star Wars, my instinct is to design them on the computer and to cut them in pieces on my laser. This is more of a time saver than a required method, and when you're trying to balance a bunch of different projects, speed is always a huge consideration. Now that's not to say that it's required to have any of these tools to do the projects I've covered in my videos, but because I've spent the bulk of my life as a digital designer, this is just a preference for working where I'm most comfortable. Speaking of design, these are based off of years of exposure to the Star Wars design aesthetic with elements added that would allow me to feature some of the random parts I've collected over the years for projects just like this one. So now that I have all of my panel pieces cut out, I can get into assembly. The boxes are all made from 1/8" MDF with finger joints to help with alignment, but almost always cause me some kind of problem when it comes to assembly, which is both good and bad. The good is that I know the seams will be tight. The bad is that those same tight seams can be challenging for assembly without me getting more glue on my fingers than I'd like. But regardless, I've always found this to be an easy solution for panels like these. Now that I've got their assembly out of the way, everything needed to get sealed with a clear coat. Now because MDF is really absorbent, I like to make sure there's something applied to the boxes as a sealer so that the actual color layers of paint won't look patchy. There's a variety of products you can use for this, everything from standard clear coats to more specialized products like liquid sanding sealer. All of them work, I just like the convenience of rattle cans. Of course, I could have used matte black acrylic and skipped this step completely, but because I knew I'd be changing the exterior color, it didn't seem worth the extra expense. Plus, acrylic can be a bit more fragile than MDF. When the clear coat is dry, I use a matte black spray paint to black out the interior of the boxes, which should help their contents stand out a bit more. This is one of those steps where I often consider taking a different approach and applying a mix of dark colors to add depth, since I know that if this were a real panel holding a bunch of mechanical parts and things, it wouldn't be a single flat color. It would be whatever color the box is, plus the color of grease or adhesives used in the assembly or maintenance of this part, but since I know that nearly every inch of the box will be filled with other parts and things, I decided to keep it simple. Another consideration is whether or not something will be visible in the completed prop, and in this case, I don't think it will be. For this project, it's all about whatever cost and time-saving steps I can take that will still get me to a product I'm satisfied with. So mottled paint is out. These face panels are going to get painted in a medium gray, so I can apply the same clear coat to seal the MDF, and when it's dry, coat them in a gray spray paint, and then start my first weathering pass by dusting the matte black spray paint I used for the interior over the top of these panels. I don't bother waiting for the gray paint to dry in this step, since the wet paint will allow for a little bit of blending to happen as I dust the paint over the panels, which I think looks a bit more interesting. This method works for other colors as well. For example, I'm using this really punchy red and a satin finish on the circle detail, and I'm overlaying a bit of red oxide primer to help dull it down and give it a more dingy appearance. With all the base colors sorted out, I can shift to the part of the build that is essentially a big puzzle. I've collected a bunch of parts from old hard drives, coffee makers, 3D printed parts from abandoned projects, as well as a ton of old circuit boards, and will use those to create unique features that will be housed in the panel boxes. This is the one part of builds like these that I find the most challenging, since it's not just about gluing a bunch of stuff together and placing it inside a box. It's about creating a cohesive look that gives the impression that these pieces serve a purpose. Additionally, there's only so many hero Greeblies you can add to a panel before it starts to look too busy. So there's a lot of visual editing happening as well. placing objects together, seeing what they look like with the faceplate on, making small adjustments, checking it again, until everything looks right. What I find helpful is to look at the combination of parts and think about what they might do if it were a real object. Is this part of the hyperdrive or just responsible for running the ship's lights? If it's the former, should there be wires coming out of it, and if so, how many? Should the parts lay flat against the back of the box, or should I give it more dimension by propping some parts up a bit and recessing some others? These are all the questions I need answered before I can get to the assembly part of the build, especially since everything will need to get painted in a unified color before I get to gluing them into the boxes. This unifying color is not just about hiding the markings, but also understanding that these panels, to a certain degree, are meant to fade into the background. So making them more uniform in color makes it more about the shapes and details of these pieces to create an overall aesthetic without really drawing the attention away from more hero parts of the space. The exception to this approach is when I want to add a more interesting object to break up the panel. This could be those hero Greeblies I mentioned, or even simple organic shapes like pieces of wire loom or exposed wires. If everything was the same, it might look too intentional and uninteresting. But by adding in pops of color or varieties of finishes like metallics, it not only breaks up the panel but gives the eye something to focus on, which also can help to distract from other areas that may not be as interesting, which is always a concern of mine when I'm working on anything like this. Once I've got all the panels figured out and parts installed, I can brighten up the blacked out pieces with some silver dry brushing. This keeps the overall monochromatic appearance of the computer parts, but helps to make the shapes stand out a little bit more. It's more of a highlight than anything else. My biggest concern is that I'm not leaving any brush strokes, since that breaks the illusion. Thankfully, the dry brushing is subtle, and you can vary the application to give a more interesting finish. And once I've got all my highlights taken care of, I can introduce a bit of grime to the brighter parts of the panels with some oil paints. This could be done with a variety of paints. I just like using oils for this type of weathering because it has a really long working time and can be finessed until it's exactly how I want it. My intention here is to bring down the shine of these brighter pieces and make it a bit more cohesive without completely taking away the tonal changes created with the variety of colors and finishes. I also think about how people might interact with these parts and what kind of stains might develop over years of abuse. That helps me to determine how light or heavy I should go with my application and what areas may need more or less weathering. At this point, my only thought is adding in hardware and trying to decide whether or not I want to add in any of the silver marker paint chipping that I like to do, which in this case, I don't think necessarily makes sense if I go with the story that these boxes are made of bare metal. Now I may revisit the weathering after taking some time away from working on them, but as of now, I like how these look, and even more importantly, so does the client. Now, hopefully this gave you some insight into my thought process and maybe some questions to ask yourself as you set off on a project of your own. And if for nothing else, Maybe it gave you some ideas for building a bit of Star Wars for your own space. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. But most importantly, go make something.